Welcome back to the channel, everybody. I'm Dino. If you remember, a couple of weeks ago, I showed you how to remove the coilover shock and spring out of my DR650. And at that time, I promised you that I would show you how to service one of these shocks. And today is that day. I've got it in my Jeep right now, and I'm gonna head from Niagara Falls over to Welland, Ontario to Performance Shock and Custom. And you're gonna get to meet my friend Oliver, who's gonna talk to us about the importance of servicing your shock if it is indeed serviceable. So why don't you sit back, grab yourself something warm to drink, and enjoy Dino's Tinker Shed. I'll see you in a minute. Well, Oliver, here's the shock from my Suzuki DR650. And everyone, I want to introduce you to my buddy here, Oliver Audet, from Performance Shock and Custom here in Welland, Ontario. And Oliver, can you tell everybody a little bit about what you do here?
Well, I rebuild shocks for off-road vehicles. We specialize in snowmobiles, but we do ATVs, side-by-sides, dirt bikes, anything off-road.
Yeah. And I don't know what kind of condition this thing's going to be in, but you're going to take it apart and give me an idea if I need to replace parts and things like that.
Exactly, right? Dino. These shocks, although they're called rebuildable, it actually means serviceable, and they need service quite often. A lot of people neglect it, but they do need service from time to time. The oil gets contaminated, it gets foamy, you lose your dampening, you get a leak, you get mud in there, but they definitely need service.
Yeah. And I remember that was the first thing Oliver told me when I said I have a rebuildable shock, is he stressed the fact these things do need service occasionally, and today we're going to do just that.
So what you got here, Dino, is you got a KYB. KYB and Showa are the main suspension makers for off-road dirt bikes, Kawasaki, Yamaha, so forth. KTM uses a shock called WP, which is made offshore, but mostly what you'll see is a piggyback KYB or a Showa with compression adjustment, high speed and low speed compression adjustment. Some of them will even have rebound adjustment, which allows you to tune your rebound as well. This one doesn't. It's pretty basic, so it shouldn't be too bad of a rebuild.
Yeah, well, everybody who owns a DR knows these things are pretty prehistoric, right? Yeah. So, okay, well, maybe we can get it into the vise here and you can walk us through it.
Sure. Okay, so one of the first things we do is we have to obviously disassemble the shock, but there's a bunch of settings that the customer has the shock set at already that we need to record so we can set it back the way the customer brought it. First thing is the spring preload, and then the second thing is the adjustment for the dampening. So what I do is I count the turns in to all the way to full dampening. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. So we're at 15. And I record all this information on a sheet. So the next thing is the preload. I measure it from the threads. Dino's got 2 inches of preload on this shock. So we'll record that information. And then what we'll do is we'll back the spring off. Now you might need a spanner wrench. Don't use a hammer and a punch if you can avoid it. It just wrecks the spanner. Well, I can already see Dino has an aftermarket spring. which will give it a little bit stiffer ride. One thing I want to stress is that your shock does not set your ride height. Your shock dampens your spring rate. So your ride height on the snowmobile and a dirt bike is always set by your preload on your spring. So that's what sets your ride height, and your dampening is dampening the spring rate. Push the bump stop down. Move the spring. Do a quick inspection of the shaft. Make sure there's no pits or chrome. This one doesn't look too bad. Bump stop looks in good shape. For the year, it is dried out. Could be replaced, it doesn't have to be. Okay, the next step, I'm gonna let the air out of the bladder. I just use a valve core tool. Place a rag over it so you don't get anything in your eyes. Release the pressure. Now the shock's depressurized, so it's not dangerous. Everything's good to go here. Okay. There's a dust cap on most of them. You pry up. Okay. That exposes your seal head, which is right in here. And it's held in here with a snap ring. Okay. And you push the seal head down a little bit, just enough to get out the circlip. Circlip pops out. Now the shaft's ready to come out. Right. The next step is to pull the shaft out. Now instead of pulling it out and breaking your back, I've made this little machine here where I can remove shafts and I can stroke shock, so it makes life a lot easier. Like so. Now that I've taken out the shaft, you can see the components of the shaft here. We got the seal head, which carries the seal, and then you got your back stopper here, and then you got your compression or rebound stack and your valving piston on here. We'll get into that in a little bit. The next thing you want to do is dump out all the oil. I did keep some oil from another shock just to show everybody. This is out of a Skidoo. This has 4,700 kilometers on it. So you can see how dirty and contaminated it is. So we're going to put Dinos in here just to have a look at it. Foam and oil is no good. We don't want to see foam in there. What happens is the shock becomes emulsified and then you lose your dampening because there's air in the oil, which happens quite a bit. Push the bladder down a little bit. There's another circlip here that needs to come out. Now you don't want to wreck the threads on the Schrader valve, so I use the Schrader valve extension to pull the bladder out. Now on Dino's shock I didn't notice any oil leaking. They do sell full seal kits. Pivot Works sells seal kits. All different companies sell seal kits. Some of them come with a complete seal head, a circlip, a bladder, and a bump stop. Now this shock here isn't too bad. You'll notice that the problems with the bladder is they either get a hole in them. What happens then is the nitrogen bleeds through the rubber and emulsifies the shock, and you'll notice right away. They also start to collapse. You'll see this one starting to turn oblong. This is an extreme example of a bladder that I pulled out last night. It's obviously no good anymore. You want to change it before it gets to this point. This bladder here is runnable. It's not the greatest, but it'll still work. They lose their elasticity, they leak. And this is what holds your nitrogen charge. It puts pressure on the shim stack to stop cavitation. So when people say gas shock, do you have a gas shock, nitrogen shock? It's not really nitrogen shock. It's gas assisted. Okay, so in a monotube shock, like a snowmobile shock, there's a piston in here. It has an O-ring on it, and it sits inside the tube right about here. And on this side is the oil, and on the bottom side is your nitrogen charge, and it separates the two. So as the valving stack goes up and down, it bounces off this cushion of nitrogen. It also keeps pressure on it to stop cavitation. But for this case, dirt bike shocks have a bladder instead of a piston. The reason for that being is that dampening is more smoother and softer and more controllable as the rubber flexes. So all the parts look decent. Problem with the KYBs is if you had to change the seal head, there's a nut on here that holds the shaft on, but it's peened over, and you can't get the nut off without grinding it off. This shock here I've already modified. I've already ground this off so I can take the valving stack and the shim stack off. Okay, this one we don't have to because we're not changing the seal today, but that's what you would have to do. When you buy the kits, they do come with new nuts, so you don't have to worry about wrecking the nut. I mean, this is something you can do at home if you follow the proper instructions. The only issue is you won't be able to charge it. You'd have to find somebody to charge it with nitrogen. Okay, so now that we got Dino shock all cleaned up, it's time for do a little inspection here. So just go through the parts quickly and I'll explain to you like what some of them do. Obviously you got the body, the tube, right? The reservoir with the bladder. This is it says H&S, hard and soft. That's your piston speed adjustment. So basically there's a spool valve in here with an orifice, and the more you tighten it, the less restricted, the more restricted the oil is, so it improves dampening when you open it, vice versa. This is a pretty simple shock design. It doesn't have rebound adjust. Rebound adjust is a hollow shaft with a dial on the eyelet on this part. So if you got a shock it's like this that has rebound adjust, it's basically the same thing, except the oil doesn't have to flow through the stack. It has a bypass. So there's a hole right here, and then it comes out the end here by adjusting a needle that goes through here. So that slows down or speeds up your rebound. So this is your piston, your valving piston. Okay, this is your rebound shim stack, and that's your compression shim stack. What a shim stack is, it's just thin pieces of metal that are very flexible and very thin, and they stack them all together. So the oil is forced to go through the hole of the piston, and exaggerated deflects off the shim stack, and that's what gives you your dampening. Now there's a million different ways to adjust your dampening with different million combinations of valving. We won't get into that because it's pretty complicated. Then you got your seal head. This seal head is rebuildable. I recommend if you're doing this at home, just to buy the seal head. It's a lot easier because you need special tools to do that, right? Dust cap, bump stop, and this is your bladder, and that's your Schrader valve. So basically we're going to check the shock for any scoring, any marks, any dents or dings. Everything looks good and smooth here. I don't see any issues. The bladder looks okay. It's a little bit dried out, but there's no holes. I'm sure it'll hold air. I don't see any broken shims or any specific marks on it. And we know that the seal is holding and the O-ring looks good. So basically we're just going to do a service on this guy today. Okay, so now we're ready to assemble. First thing you want to make sure is you have your dampening all the way off so it's loose, so the oil can bleed through both sides. Okay. So I'm going to put a little bit of grease on this. Assemble the bladder so that that's together. You leave your valve stem out because we're going to be putting air in this after. Well, there is going to be oil overflowing. That's normal. You want to be able to get all the air out of it. You start by adding a little bit of oil. Comes through the other side. You pop your hand on it a few times to push the air bubbles. You only want to fill this a little bit because once you get down to here, you want to push it so that the oil actually overflows. So you want to have a little bit more in there. You don't want any air in there. This is what you want right here. So then you push that in. I put a socket over top of the valve, not to wreck it, to seat it properly. So you can get the snap ring back in. So now you're going to put your snap ring in. You hear it click in there. I'm going to pull it back up. So it's seated properly. There is some air in here still. So what you want to do is get yourself a pump. You can use an air compressor, but you got to be careful how much pressure you put in. First we'll reinstall the valve core. So you'll notice when I pump this up, you'll see some air bubbles come through. So it's imperative to get all the air out of the shock. Bleeding the shock is the most important part. If you have air in it, you're going to lose dampening. Oil compresses, or sorry, gases compress, oil doesn't. So having oil mixed with air is danger for your shock. It wears it out quicker. It'll burn it out, it'll run hotter, you won't have the proper dampening. So getting all the air out is very important to bleeding a shock. So once again, I'm going to remove the valve core. And then the way I like to do it is I'm going to put a little bit of pressure on the bladder while we bleed the shock. I'm going to put about 5 to 10 pounds in it. I'm going to leave it at that.
Why don't you just use regular air in there? Why does it have to be nitrogen?
Air is a bunch of different things. It's got argon, it's got moisture, it's got everything in there. It expands at different rates. Nitrogen is an inert gas. It's got bigger molecules than air, so it doesn't pass through the aluminum. Aluminum's porous, right? That's why they use nitrogen in cars. So now that we got the bubbles out of that, we're going to top this up, but not all the way. So about 1.5 inches down. Okay. Now it's time to bleed the valving stack. So you just put this back in, nice and slow. Now you want to bleed the air out of the stack. You do that by stroking it up and down. You'll see the air bubbles release. Then I like to tap it with a hammer. That forces all the air out. You'll actually be able to hear if there's any air squeaking by. You can still hear a bit. So you do faster motions. Basically just takes your time. You don't want any air in there at all. Another way too, once you get it bled pretty decent, you could try and add a little bit more air to see if you can push the last of the air out. Make the bladder a bit stiffer so it doesn't compress as much, so it bounces the air back. Alright, we're good here. So take the valve core out again. because you want to compress that. You want the bladder to compress. Oh, shit. So now you want to bring the shaft up as high as you can. Make sure this is loose. And now you're going to dunk your seal head. You want oil to pour out right down to that O-ring. And then you dunk the head. You want to push it just past the snap ring groove. Install the circlip. And you hear a nice snap when it goes in. Then you want to pull the shock up. All the way up. Okay. So there's two types of nitrogen charging for off-road vehicle shocks. There's a Schrader valve, which everybody knows is a bicycle valve, and then there's a needle type rubber bladder type filler valve. So I've developed a panel that does both instead of changing fittings out. This is the fixture I use for the needle valve, which is a hypodermic needle. The way I have this set up right here with the bleed off and that allows me to have complete control over how much nitrogen I put in. Dino's type is a Schrader valve, so we're going to be using this attachment. Okay, so the first thing you want to do is tighten your valve core back up. Okay, so we're going to fill Dino shock up to 150. That's the spec for this shock. So I open the gas, put it at right 150. So now I know it's right at 150. So after you pressurize your shock, I pressure test every shock that comes in here to make sure that there's no leaks. We don't want to have any bladder leaks or any piston leaks. Everything's pressure tested and stroked. We're looking good here, no air bubbles. That's what you want to see. This looks good. A little bit of oil left in here. Just kind of mop that up. Put our Schrader valve cap back on. Put our dust seal back together. That's it. Now we're going to go in our custom shock dyno and test it. I stroke every shock to make sure everything's going good. What you want is a nice smooth rebound all the way. Okay, that's coming up all the way. So now we're going to adjust some of the settings on it. So we're going to bring it out. We're going to go 5 clicks. So that's as far as it can go. Don't jam these tight. They just click. Once they stop and they don't click no more, back it off to the last click and that's your position. So we're going to go back 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There we go. Back to good. Very cool. And that's it. Pretty much put your spring back on to the length that you measured before. Put your seal head, your spring retainer back on. Make sure you double nut this. Make sure you push that tight up against the other one. And that's pretty much it. Okay, Dino, here's your rebuilt shock, ready to go back on your 650.
Oliver, it looks amazing. It looks like brand new. I love it. I'm going to take it home and I'm going to clean my spring up and the mounts and that, and I'm going to put it back in the bike, and we'll do a video on that as well.
Awesome.
Oliver, what are some things a person might look at that would indicate they need this shock service, or how frequently would you recommend it to be serviced?
On that style shock, depending on like how you ride it, if you're on-road, off-road, signs of wear would be if you see any leaking, oil leaking on your spring or down the seal head. If you're riding it, it becomes like a pogo. If your ass is bouncing off the seat, stuff like that, then chances are you've lost the oil and the nitrogen charge. Trying to keep them clean. The shafts are the most important. You get rocks and stuff stuck in there and mud in there, it scratches the shafts. I would recommend like an average rider every 2 years at least get it charged up, right? I mean, it's not a big deal to change the oil and recharge it.
Yeah.
They're meant to be serviced. If you have any issues, you'll know. Your suspension will deteriorate, you'll know.
Right.
And don't be afraid to play with the settings on the shock. There is rebound adjust, there is harder and softer, your spring rate. Get familiar with these things so you know what kind of terrain, what terrain you're in, what adjustments to set at. Take a little notebook with you and don't be afraid to play with the adjustments on it,
Yeah.
to learn how it works.
Yeah. And I'm a pretty, we've talked about this on the channel before, I'm a pretty easy rider. Most of my time spent on the road, and when I'm off-road, it's usually gravel or double track, fire roads, things like that. I don't really jump this bike, but if someone rode this bike a little more aggressive, you could actually tune this a little bit, right?
Yeah, there's lots of valving packages available from Race Tech. There's lots of aftermarket kits to make them stiffer, longer, jumping, whatever you like. It's endless, the amount of valving.
Right.
I deal with Race Tech. They offer a Gold Series line for valving, and there's even a reservoir extension for more volume of air.
Okay.
And I do offer race setups and all kinds of custom setups for customers that are light, customers that have ice fishing setups with lots of weight. I can tune snowmobile suspensions endlessly. I service all snowmobile shocks, and I have some for sale for different models and different sleds too.
And I know I'm going to get some comments asking what type and what weight of oil did you put in this?
I'm an advocate of AMSOIL. I used AMSOIL Shock Therapy Light.
Okay.
That's what most suspensions use.
In terms of custom shafts and things, you can actually build a custom shaft for the shock, right?
Yeah.
If you needed to, out
Yeah.
of solid stainless.
Right. I sponsor a few race teams, snowmobile race teams. One's an Arctic Cat team, and I build custom length shocks for them. All my shafts are machined by a local fellow, Joe Mammal from North Shore R&D. He makes all my shafts, the ones that we can. And it's made, we've sourced out materials, 400 stainless steel series, and it's case hardened 40 thou out of 50 Rockwell, so you can't scratch it. I find it to be more reliable than the chrome, because the chrome will chip and then you'll get a little void, and every time the seal passes the void it lets out a bit of oil or it'll tear the seal. I tell all my snowmobile customers too that the shafts are everything. If you could save your shafts, they sell shock covers. I recommend putting those on to keep all the dirt and the sand out.
Yeah, I'll have to get a set of those for my XS chassis because I don't have them right now, so it's good preventative maintenance. So
All right.
Great. Oliver, I really do appreciate all the work you've put into this today, and I would encourage anybody that needs their shocks rebuilt to bring them over here. I'll include a link to your website. And can people ship shocks to you? Do you do that?
Yep, I have customers all over Canada. I offer free shipping through Canada Post. My turnaround rate's really quick. I stock most seals, common shafts. I stock quite a bit of parts.
Fantastic. Okay, well, buddy, thank you so much.
Thanks for coming, Dino.
I cannot wait to get this thing home. I'm going to polish that spring up, and I'll set it all and get it into the shock. So everybody, I really do appreciate you stopping by here at Dino's Tinker Shed, and I can't thank Oliver enough to let us come in and see how a real professional rebuilds these shocks. And I hope to see you soon next time on Dino's Tinker Shed. Dude, amazing, amazing work. You're an artist. You really are.
Appreciate it.